The oldest stories we have, they didn't just spread anywhere. They followed roads, camel roads, shipping lanes. That's the real geography of myth. It's a map of trade. Not of countries, but of these old corridors where things moved. And the creatures, the tales, they didn't show up randomly around the world. They only appeared in certain places. They grew along these historic routes of commerce. They traveled with the cargo, with the spices, the silks, the silver moving between empires. So mythology, it ends up being the original cargo. The first thing that got globalized, it's a record, a living record of how people were connected. You see it in the details. A dragon in Central Asia, that's not one idea. It's a fusion, pieces from China, pieces from Persia, brought together on the trade roads, or a giant bird from Arab stories that grew from whispers. From talk on the Indian Ocean between sailors, so the simple act of trade, of moving goods, it built the stories that civilizations lived by. That cultural DNA was never meant to stay put. These stories, you have to see them as inventory, not folklore, but a kind of cargo, as real as spices or silk in a merchant's pack. That's the shift. Myths were the original intellectual property, the spiritual software that moved with the hardware of civilization. A trader from the Levant wouldn't just bring frankincense. He'd bring the story of the desert spirits guarding the trees it came from. And that story wasn't just a bonus, it was part of the pitch. It added a layer of mystique, a sacred origin that made the physical product more desirable. More valuable, the tale itself had a market price, paid in attention, paid in retelling. So these myths were designed to travel, built to be adaptable, not rigid. A story about a river spirit in India could, over a few hundred miles, after a dozen retellings along a trade route, become a story about a lake guardian in Persia. The core function stayed, explaining the unknown power of water, but the details, the name, the specific fears, those would shift to fit the new audience. It was cultural barter. You hear my story about a clever trickster god. I listen to yours about a wise mountain giant. By the end of the journey, both stories have changed. Borrowing a little from each other, becoming something new. That's why the map of mythology looks the way it does. You don't find identical stories scattered randomly. You find families of stories, lineages of ideas, and they trace a path you can follow on a map, a path paved by merchants, pilgrims, soldiers. The story was a commodity. And like any good product, it had to be authentic to its origin but flexible enough for a foreign market. So where did these narrative trade routes actually run? The answer is in the geography of human connection. A local footpath through a forest connecting two villages. Stories travel there, but they stay local. They evolve slowly within a familiar circle. Now picture a road that stretches for thousands of miles connecting empires. That's a different thing. It's not just a line on a map, it's a living corridor. For a myth to travel the world, it needed more than a path. It needed an ecosystem, and the historic trade corridors were that ecosystem. The Silk Road is the famous one, but there were others. The incense route, moving sacred resins from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean. The Amber Road, channeling fossilized resin from the Baltic down to Rome. The trans-Saharan networks, where gold and salt and ideas crossed the desert on camels. These were the superhighways, what made them so powerful for carrying stories. First, they were sustained. These weren't seasonal trails used for a few years. They operated for centuries, sometimes over 1,000 years. That timescale is crucial. It allowed for the slow percolation of an idea. A story could enter in one era and emerge, transformed, centuries later at the other end. It had time to be told and retold. To be misunderstood and reinterpreted. To blend with other tales it met along the way. Second, these corridors created prolonged interaction. a merchant didn't sprint from one end to the other. He moved in stages, stopping at caravanserais, those fortified inns, waiting for seasons to change, for ships to arrive, for markets to open. In these way stations, these multilingual hubs, people from different worlds were forced to coexist, sometimes for months. And during those long nights you talk, you share stories to pass the time, to build trust, to explain where you came from. The tale becomes a cultural passport. Finally, these corridors weren't monolithic. They were networks, main arteries and countless smaller capillaries feeding into them. A story from a remote village could find its way to a local market road, then to a regional hub, and finally be uploaded onto the main trunk of the Silk Road. This structure created points of intense convergence, cities like Samarkand, Baghdad under the Abbasids, ports like Calicut on the Indian Ocean. These were the ancient world's server farms. Here, narratives from China, India, Persia, the Mediterranean, the steppes would crash together. They'd be compared, synced, hybridized. A traveler would hear a dozen versions of a flood myth or a dragon legend. And the version he carried away would be a composite built from many sources. So to map a myth's journey, you don't just draw a straight line, you trace its path through this ancient internet. From its origin, through the hubs where it was processed, to its final destination where it took on a new local identity, the corridor was the medium. And the story was the message. You see it in one image, a Chinese dragon on silk, sinuous, often in clouds or water, a symbol of celestial power, benevolent authority. Then a winged serpent from an ancient Persian relief, a beast of chaos, a monster for a hero to slay, two different ideas from two different worlds. But somewhere along the dusty stretches between them, in the caravanserais of the Taklamakan, these ideas met. They married. The Chinese long was not a monster. It was an embodiment of natural forces, water. It brought rain, shaped rivers, a sign of imperial mandate. Wise, often shown with a pearl. From the west came another tradition. The Mushachek letter 1, E2 Bushachek U of Mesopotamia, a hybrid serpent dragon, a divine attendant, and from Persian myth, the Ajay Dahoka, a three-headed serpent demon, falsehood, oppression. These were adversaries, embodiments of evil to be conquered. So the wise water spirit from the east meets the chaotic serpent monster from the west. They don't cancel out. They blend. In the trading kingdoms of Central Asia, like Sogdia, a new creature emerges. It keeps the serpentine body, maybe the association with precious places guarding mountain springs, secret oases along the route. But it gains an ambivalent nature. It could be a protector of a pass, demanding respect or tribute, or a destructive force, a hoarder of treasure a hero must confront. This hybrid dragon-serpent became the perfect myth for the Silk Road itself. It represented the power and danger of the journey. The treasure was real silks, spices, gems. The guardians were the real perils, the desert, the bandits, the vast distances. The myth gave those abstract dangers a form. A Sogdian merchant might tell a tale of a dragon guarding a particular well. That story had a practical purpose. It warned travelers to approach with caution, to respect the site, maybe leave a small offering. The myth managed behavior. It created a shared narrative for people from a dozen different cultures, all facing the same threat of dying of thirst. So the dragon was no longer purely Chinese or purely Persian. It became a Central Asian entity, a creature of the corridor itself. Its hybrid nature proved its origin, a living receipt of cultural exchange stamped by the journey. This is how trade corridors build mythology. They don't just move stories, they cook them. They take raw narrative ingredients from distant kitchens and simmer them together over centuries. A whole new dish, and once that new myth exists, it too becomes cargo. It travels further, westward. This blend would influence the dragons of medieval Europe. Eastward, it might circle back to China with new, more monstrous attributes. The corridor was a loop, a feedback system for the imagination, but this fusion wasn't limited to land. If you look to the sea, to the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, you find a different kind of mythic engine at work. The open ocean is a corridor without roads, without walls, and out there, the mythic engine runs on wind, on rumor. For centuries, Arab and Persian dhows, those wooden ships with lateen sails, would catch the monsoon winds. They'd ride them from the Persian Gulf down to the coast of India, to the islands of the East Indies. Their cargo was the scent of empires, cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, but in their holds and in the stories told on deck, they carried something else, something that grew larger with every league. They carried the idea of a bird so vast it could blot out the sun. We know it as the Roc from the Arabian Nights, but its origins are a map of maritime trade. It starts with real encounters, sailors from the Arabian Peninsula reaching East Africa or hearing tales of Madagascar would have seen the ostrich, a flightless bird taller than a man, an astonishing sight, or they would have heard whispers passed from island to island about the elephant bird of Madagascar, which stood over 10 feet tall and only went extinct in the last 1,000 years. To a sailor used to gulls, these were already creatures of legend, but then they reached the ports of southern India. And there, in the spice markets and the temple carvings, they encountered a fully formed divine myth, Garuda. In Hindu tradition, Garuda is the king of birds, the mount of the god Vishnu, immense, golden, radiant, a being of speed and power, an enemy to serpents. This wasn't just a big animal, this was a cosmic entity. So imagine the sailor's mind, trying to reconcile these two threads, the physical evidence of gigantic birds from the African routes, and the theological, symbolic scale of Garuda from the Indian ports. On the long voyage home, with nothing but waves and stars for weeks, these threads began to braid together. The trader's mind, always seeking the more fantastic story, did what it does. It exaggerated, it synthesized. The big bird from Africa gained the divine scale of Garuda. It grew and grew until it was no longer a bird of the land but a monarch of the sky above the sea. A creature whose wingspan could shadow a ship, a beast that nested on remote islands, places just like the mysterious sources of the spices themselves. The myth of the Roc became a narrative counterpart to the spice trade. The spices were tiny, fragrant, packed in sacks. The Roc was colossal, terrifying. Dominating the open sky, one represented immense value condensed into a small package. The other represented the immense, terrifying scale of the journey. The ocean was an abyss, a place of vulnerability. A storm could swallow a ship whole. The Roc gave that formless danger a shape, a predator you could picture. A reason why certain islands were forbidden, why certain winds felt ominous. It made the unknown knowable, even if that knowledge was fear. So the Roc didn't just travel the spice routes. It was born from them, its very essence a hybrid of African reality and Indian divinity, scaled to the vastness of the ocean, is a product of that corridor. The cinnamon in a Baghdad marketplace came with an invisible warranty, a story of the impossible distances overcome, the titanic perils. The story added value to the spice. But this process of myth-making along trade corridors, it wasn't always about creating monsters. Sometimes it was about creating common ground, a shared language of belief. That could make trade possible, even coexistence between wildly different peoples. These stories needed a voice, a human one. They needed a person to carry them. Across the miles, over the years, that person wasn't a scholar. He was a man with dust in his clothes, salt on his skin, a head full of wonders he couldn't really explain. The caravan master, the sailor, the pilgrim, the diplomat, they were the myth bearers. Their lives were the corridor. They were the original network. And they did more than repeat stories, they translated them. They interpreted the world as they went, using what they had: memory, imagination, a need to make sense of impossible things. Think of a merchant on the Silk Road 1,000 years ago. He's crossing the go-by. In the cliffs, wind-scoured, he sees something jutting from the rock. Massive, curved shapes, bones, but too large for any animal he knows. To him, they aren't fossils. They're proof, physical proof of a story. So he does what a storyteller does. He connects the dots. He weaves those bones into a tale he already knows. Tells his companions around the fire that night, this is the ribcage of a dragon. Slain by a great hero from his own homeland, he's anchored a curiosity to a narrative, made the foreign landscape familiar, created a new local legend. That site might be known for generations as the place the dragon fell. The travelers need to process the unfamiliar. That was the engine or a Portuguese sailor. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope for the first time, the storms there are legendary, furious winds, waves from nowhere. It feels personal, like the sea itself is trying to kill you. How do you explain that in a Lisbon tavern? You personify it. You give it a name, a story, so the tale grows, a ghost ship cursed to sail those waters forever. A warning: the Flying Dutchman isn't just a spooky story. It's a navigational hazard made myth, a way for sailors who survived to explain the terror to those on land. The story was a release, a practical warning for future voyages, but the traveler's role went beyond explaining landscapes. It was social currency. A caravan master arrives at a caravanserai in Samarkand. He doesn't just show his silks, he performs. He shares news, but more importantly, wonders. The tale of a city with a giant statue, a fruit that tasted like honey and flowers. A wise man who could read the stars like a map. These stories were his credentials, proved he'd been to far places, built his reputation, built rapport. In exchange, he'd listen to their local legends, absorb the tale of the mountain spirit protecting their valley, and when he moved on, he carried that story. Changed it subtly to fit the understanding of his next audience. This constant exchange around campfires in portside inns, that was the true workshop. The professional traveler was a living filter. He took raw experience and distilled it into a narrative that could travel. His close call with a sandstorm became the breath of a desert djinn. His glimpse of a whale became evidence of a sea monster. His stories weren't lies, they were human-scale translations of a world too vast and strange for mere facts. They were the original travel blogs, written not in words but in shared memory, and their influence shaped the imagination of entire continents. A story isn't just the plot. It's the sound of the words, the language itself, and on those old roads, language wasn't a wall. It was a furnace, a crucible. Myths got melted down and remade. For trade to happen, people speaking dozens of tongues had to communicate. They didn't learn each other's languages fully. They made new ones, pidgins. Lingua francas, simple hybrid languages built for one thing: commerce, to barter for grain, to set a price for silk, to ask for water. These trade tongues were bare bones. Words for objects, numbers, basic actions, but they didn't have the subtlety for poetry, for theology, for the intricate layers of a sacred story. So picture a Buddhist monk traveling from India into Central Asia. He's carrying the Jataka tales, these beautiful, complex stories about the Buddha's past lives. They're woven with specific philosophical terms, nuances of karma and compassion rooted deep in Sanskrit and Pali. He wants to share them, to translate them for the Sogdian merchants who give him passage. But the trade tongue they share, this rough language of the road, has no word for the precise shade of a spiritual concept. It can handle a donkey, a price, a direction, but not enlightenment, so the monk simplifies. He strips the story down to its most powerful core. He tells a tale of a king who gives away his eyes, or a hare who leaps into a fire to feed a hungry holy man. The specific doctrinal lesson softens. What's left is a stark, powerful fable about incredible generosity. About self-sacrifice, a universal kernel of morality. That kernel, now freed from its complex shell, becomes portable. It can roll like a marble down the trade corridor. A Turkic storyteller hears it at a caravanserai. He doesn't know the Buddha. He doesn't need to. He hears a story about a great chief who showed ultimate bravery for his people. And he takes that kernel, he reclothes it, he sets it in his own landscape with his own heroes, his own understanding of honor. The story is reborn. It becomes a Turkic epic. The original isn't lost, it's transformed. This linguistic filtering was constant. It meant only the most resilient, most human story elements survived the long journey. The stories that made it across continents weren't the most theologically precise. They were the most emotionally resonant. A story about a trickster outwitting a giant. A tale of a lost love found through a magical token. A warning about greed from a spirit who guards a spring. These cores were durable. You could drop them into any culture, any language, and they'd make sense. They were the narrative seeds, and the trade corridors were the wind that scattered them. The local culture at the destination was the soil. It gave them new shape, new leaves, new blossoms. So the map of a myth spread is also a map of linguistic compromise, of stories being translated not just between languages, but between entire ways of seeing the world. And surviving because their heart was simple enough to be understood by anyone, anywhere. This process didn't just spread stories, it created a strange, shared storybook across Eurasia. You find the same basic plots, the same character types from Ireland to Japan, not because one civilization copied another, but because these story kernels traveled the superhighways. They were simplified and readapted at every stop. They became a common human currency, but if language shaped the journey, the destinations themselves left the final, deepest mark. The place where a traveling myth finally settled. Gold in these stories is never just gold. It's a character, a temptation, a test. You have the dragon, coiled in its mountain lair, sleeping on a pile of coins and gems. That image is a reflection. It mirrors the wealth that pooled in the trading hubs. A city like Samarkand didn't just have markets, it had treasuries. Vaults filled with silver from Persia, jade from cotton, pearls from the Indian Ocean. To a traveler from a poor village, that concentrated wealth would seem supernatural. As if it were guarded by something more than walls and soldiers, so the story gave that feeling a form. The dragon wasn't just a monster, it was hoarded capital. The treasure was real but inaccessible, protected by a terrifying force. The myth becomes a lesson. The hero who slays the dragon and takes the gold isn't just brave. He's navigating high-stakes commerce, taking a monumental risk for a legendary reward. The story encodes the entire merchant's gamble. This pattern repeats where trade flourished. In Norse myths, the dragon Fafnir guards a cursed hoard. In Central Asia, spirits protect caves of silver. These aren't random fantasies. They are economic anxieties dressed in scales and fire. They teach a clear lesson. Great wealth exists, but it is always guarded by physical danger, by moral compromise, by sheer luck. To reach it requires more than a map. It requires cunning, courage, perhaps a sacrifice. The myth prepares the mind for the marketplace, but the warnings were often more direct. Tales of treacherous spirits haunting a desert canyon, or a river demon drowning the unwary at a ford. On the surface, they explain a natural hazard, a sudden sandstorm, a flash flood, but listen to the details. These spirits often demand a toll, a sacrifice. They take your most valuable camel, your firstborn child in some versions, a portion of your goods. This is a symbolic commentary on the human threats of the road. The bandit chieftain who controlled a mountain pass and demanded payment. The corrupt official at a frontier town who invented new taxes. The myth gave a supernatural face to these man-made dangers. It turned a political extortion into a universal law. You couldn't argue with a bandit king, just as you couldn't argue with a desert djinn. The story taught preparedness, caution, the wisdom of sometimes paying the price to move forward. It was risk management written in folklore. Then there is the sea, the vast trackless market of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Here, the greatest mythic danger was often beauty itself. The siren, the mermaid, her song was irresistible, promising knowledge, pleasure, safe harbor, but it led ships onto the rocks. On one level, this is a metaphor for navigational error. A misreading of the stars, a misjudgment of the coastline, could destroy a vessel and its cargo, financial ruin delivered by a simple mistake. But on another level, the siren's song represents a deeper peril of the trade economy. The lure of a deal that seems too good to be true, the charming, untrustworthy partner in a distant port, the promise of a shortcut to riches that leads only to loss. The myth personifies the seductive, hidden dangers of commerce in an age of slow communication and no contracts. It taught distrust. It taught that the most attractive opportunity could be the most deadly. So these stories were never just entertainment around a campfire. They were a symbolic curriculum, an oral guidebook for a world without written laws or insurance. They packaged complex economic realities, hoarding, extortion, fraud, catastrophic risk into memorable, visceral narratives. A young merchant listening to his uncle tell of the dragon's cave wasn't just hearing a fairy tale. He was receiving a seminar on wealth concentration and the ethics of acquisition. The traveler who repeated the story of the toll-demanding spirit at the pass was disseminating a travel advisory. This is how culture hardens into wisdom. The trade corridors generated immense value, but also immense vulnerability. The myths that grew along them were the system's own folklore. They documented its pressures, its injustices, its dreams. They were the collective conscience of the marketplace, whispering warnings and encoding the rules of survival for anyone bold enough to listen. A map of these traveling stories is defined by its empty spaces too. For every myth that moved across continents, so many others never left their valley. They stayed anchored to a single hill or a sacred grove, or a bend in a river known only to a few families. That silence on the world stage tells you something. It tells you as much as the epics that traveled. The stories that moved had a certain shape, they had a portable core, they were built for export. The ones that stayed were often too specific, too tied to a place or a practice that couldn't be translated. Think of a mountain spirit worshipped by one isolated village in the Caucasus. Its story is the story of that mountain. Its personality is the weather on its slopes, the shape of its cliffs, the spring that comes from its base. To tell that story in a marketplace in Baghdad, you'd have to start by describing the mountain. You'd have to make the listener care about a piece of geography they'll never see. The story has no hook without the land. It's a local secret, a covenant between a people and a place. It has no reason to travel because its power doesn't transfer. It's a myth on a very short leash. Then there are myths bound not to geography but to power. To the intricate machinery of a state, the elaborate rituals of the Egyptian pharaoh, for instance, where the king was a living god, a perfect fusion of political and cosmic order. That was a magnificent, all-encompassing myth, but it wasn't a story you could easily tell over a campfire to a Hittite merchant. It was embedded in 1,000 details of court ceremony, in hieroglyphs on temple walls, in the very architecture of Thebes. To explain it, you'd have to explain the entire civilization. It was a closed system. A myth for internal consumption, designed to reinforce a specific social hierarchy, not to make friends with foreigners. These stories were like heavy, ornate furniture. Beautiful, meaningful, but impossible to carry on a camel. So the filter. What did the trade corridor select for? It favored stories with a simple, powerful, detachable motif. A monster in a lake, a city of gold lost in the desert, a fountain that grants eternal youth, a single magical object. These are narrative kernels. You can explain a monster in 3 sentences. A listener from any culture understands fear, understands the concept of a creature in the water. You don't need to explain the entire theology of the lake. Just the danger, the treasure, the wonder. These portable cores are like narrative currency. They have a clear, universal value. Everyone wants to avoid a monster. Everyone dreams of a lost city. Everyone fears a curse. The trade corridor, with its constant translation and simplification, acted like a sieve. It let these small, hard nuggets of story pass through. The complex, localized, state-bound myths were too bulky. They got left behind. This is why the world's great traveling storybook has a certain feel. It's full of dragons, not mountain gods. It's full of magical springs, not pharaonic succession rituals. It's full of talking animals and clever tricksters, not elaborate temple liturgies. The corridor created a shared canon. A merchant from Venice and a trader from Xi'an might not share a language or a religion, but they could both understand a story about a giant bird that carries off elephants. That story became a piece of common ground, a cultural handshake. It meant that even in a strange land, some parts of the human imagination felt familiar. This filtering process had a consequence. It created 2 parallel worlds of myth. One was global, or at least hemispheric, a network of shared tales that connected peoples across vast distances. The other was intensely local, a mosaic of thousands of unique, place-bound spirits and stories. One was the story of the road, the other was the story of the home. And the road, by its very nature, could only carry the stories built for travel. You could hold these stories in your hand, not in a book but in clay. In stone, in gold. To follow a myth, sometimes you stop reading, you start digging. The evidence is in the dirt, along the old roads, in the ruins, at the bottom of the sea. Objects tell a silent story. They tell you what people carried and what they thought was worth carrying. Think of the Amber Road. For centuries, this northern route moved amber from the Baltic shores down to Rome and Byzantium. But it wasn't just the amber that moved. A symbol moved with it, a small, wheel-shaped amulet, often carved from that same amber. Archaeologists find these amulets all along the route. From the Baltic forests to the Danube frontier, they show a solar wheel, a symbol of protection. Of the sun's journey, this wasn't a local fashion. This was a portable idea. A trader from the north selling amber in a Roman town. He wasn't just selling a stone. He was offering a piece of his world's safety. The buyer, maybe a Roman soldier far from home, might wear it, not for its original meaning, but for his own idea of a guardian sun. The object made the trade, but the symbol made a deeper exchange. It let a belief hitch a ride, to be adopted, reinterpreted, without a word being translated. The amulet is a fossilized agreement, proof that along this road people agreed on what needed protecting, even if they didn't agree on the protector's name. Travel east to the meeting point of the world, the caves of Dunhuang on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. A Silk Road library carved into rock. On its walls you see cultural collision. Painted in color, in these Buddhist caves funded by Sogdian merchants, you see something. The guardian King Vaisravana, a protector of the north, but his image borrows from the Persian god of victory, Varithragna. He might have a flaming halo from Zoroastrian art. His armor might look like a Central Asian warrior's. This isn't confusion. It's synthesis. The artists, local to the region, serving a mixed community, they created a new divine image. One that a Buddhist pilgrim from China could look at, a Zoroastrian trader from Persia could look at, a nomad from the steppes could look at, and each might see a fragment of their own truth. Their own idea of sacred power in the same figure. The mural was a spiritual crossroads made visible. It didn't preach one doctrine, it built a bridge. Using the shared visual language of the trade route itself, the painting was an argument for compatibility. It said the gods of the road could work together. And sometimes the evidence sinks. In the Java Sea, shipwrecks from the spice trade rest on the seabed. Among plates and coins, divers find small terracotta figurines. Hindu deities like Ganesha, the remover of obstacles, these weren't temple statues, they were personal, belonging to a merchant or a sailor, placed on a tiny altar in a ship's cramped quarters. This figurine is a snapshot. It tells us belief wasn't left behind. It was packed as essential cargo for a trader sailing from a Hindu kingdom in Java to a Muslim sultanate in Malacca. That small Ganesha was a piece of home, a spiritual anchor in a world of unpredictable seas. Its presence on the ship proves that myths were mobile infrastructure. They provided continuity. When the merchant arrived, he might keep it hidden or display it, sparking curiosity, starting a conversation. That conversation could be the start of a story's journey into a new land. The object was the seed, so these artifacts, the amulet, the mural, the figurine, they are the archaeology of imagination. They show the spread of myth wasn't vague. It was concrete, it had a weight, a shape, a place in a traveler's bag next to their food and tools. People used valuable space to carry these story forms. They were more than souvenirs, they were active participants. A protective symbol in amber offered safety to anyone who wore it. A syncretic mural in a cave offered unity to anyone who prayed before it. A statuette in a ship's hold offered comfort to its owner, and maybe introduced its form to a stranger. This material trail turns myth transmission into something you can touch. It grounds the story in the real world, the dusty, perilous, hopeful world of the people who carried it. And once a story finds a physical form, it gains a new permanence. It can survive the end of an empire, the silence of a language, the closing of a road. It waits in the earth to be found, a message from the corridor itself. These hubs weren't just stops, they were places where stories got made. A desert oasis like Palmyra was its own little world. Under those high stone arches, you'd hear a dozen languages before midday. A caravan comes in from Arabia, camels loaded with myrrh. The men gather at a well, drinking, talking. One of them tells a story about strange lights they saw in the dunes at night. He calls it a ghoul, a desert spirit that leads travelers off the path. A Roman soldier stationed there, he's listening. He doesn't know the word ghoul, but he gets the idea. To him, it sounds like a lemur, a restless, bad spirit from the beliefs back home. That night, in a different tavern, he tells the story to his friends, but now the creature has the traits of a Roman ghost. A Persian silk merchant sitting at the same table, he's nodding. In his mind, this thing lines up with a div, a demon from his own Zoroastrian stories. And he carries that blended idea east with him. That was the process. It wasn't a slow drift. It was a fast, deliberate remix. The story had to change. In that crowded, competitive space, a smoky tavern, a busy market, your story was fighting for attention. If it was too specific, too tied to the rituals of some far-off village, you'd lose them. Their eyes would just go blank, so you adapted, you sharpened the hook. You made the danger bigger or the wonder. You took out the names of local chiefs or obscure mountains that meant nothing here. You kept the core fear, the thing in the dark that wants to hurt travelers. That core was universal. Everyone in that room, no matter where they were from, knew that fear. The story in that pressure cooker got refined. It became a better product, a more tradable kind of narrative. Port cities worked the same way, but with a different rhythm. Take Calicut on the Malabar coast. For centuries, it was the city of spices. Arab dhows, Chinese junks, later Portuguese ships, all anchored in its harbor. In the warehouses and lodges by the water, men who had crossed oceans traded goods and stories. A Chinese sailor might describe a storm he thought was caused by a dragon king. An Arab navigator might tell a tale of a giant fish. a timon that could swallow a ship. A local Carolan fisherman listening might weave both ideas into his own legend of a sea serpent that guards the coast. The hybrid creature that comes out of that part dragon, part whale, part serpent, it becomes the official monster of that port. It's the story they tell every new crew that comes in. A standardized local legend made specifically for an international audience. These hubs were narrative labs because they created pressure. The pressure of time. You had to make your point before the listener moved on. The pressure of clarity. You had to be understood across language barriers. And the pressure of relevance. Your story had to connect to the shared experience of being far from home, of facing the unknown. What survived that pressure was mythic gold, a story that could make a Venetian merchant, a Mongol horseman, and an Indian spice grower all lean forward and nod. This polished, export-ready version was then packed up with the next shipment. It left the oasis or the port not as a fragile, local secret, but as a strong, compelling story, ready to grab the next audience down the line. The hub didn't just pass stories along, it made them better. A new force came along these old roads. It wasn't carried in sacks, it moved in books. The great missionary religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism in its own fashion, they changed the rules of the mythic marketplace. These weren't loose local spirits, they were organized, they had central texts, clear doctrines, and often this powerful urge to spread. And when they moved down the trade corridors, they entered a world already full of older stories. The result wasn't a simple erasure. It was this long, complex process of filtering. The corridor became a kind of negotiation table, where old gods and new doctrines had to find a way to live together. Take the Arabian Peninsula before Islam. The desert was alive with spirits, the jinn. They weren't gods but powerful, capricious beings of the empty places. They could be benevolent, they could be malicious, they were part of the fabric of the world. Then Islam emerged with its uncompromising monotheism. And these beings presented a theological problem. They couldn't be worshipped, but they couldn't just be denied either. They were too deeply woven into how people understood the landscape. So a kind of integration happened. The jinn were incorporated. The Quran redefined them. Creatures made from smokeless fire, distinct from angels and humans with free will. They became part of a larger, ordered cosmology. The old desert spirits were given a new, sanctioned role. They weren't the center of belief anymore, but they remained as inhabitants of the world, subject to the same God. This wasn't destruction, it was a doctrinal absorption. The myth was filtered, stripped of its divine authority, but preserved as a recognized part of reality. That let the new faith feel familiar. It could connect to the deep-seated psychic geography of the people it was reaching for, and the trade routes that carried Islam from Arabia to Persia to Central Asia. They carried this hybrid understanding. So a merchant from Damascus could explain a strange event in a caravanserai as the work of a jinn, and a scholar in Baghdad would nod, because the concept had a place in their shared faith. Christianity did a similar kind of alchemy, but with places. As it spread into Europe along Roman roads and river networks, it met deeply rooted pagan traditions. Sacred groves, healing springs, mountain shrines. The church could have cut down the groves. It could have sealed the springs. Sometimes it did, but often, a more pragmatic strategy won out. The old sacred site was too powerful to just discard, so it was baptized. A church or a chapel would be built right on the spot. The local deity of that place would be replaced by a Christian saint, often one whose story mirrored the old spirit's power. A Celtic goddess of a spring, associated with healing, might become Saint Brigid. A Slavic god of thunder might have his traits absorbed into the veneration of the prophet Elijah, who rode a fiery chariot to heaven. The physical location, the very spirit of the place remained sacred. Only the name and the official story changed. This was mythic rebranding on a continental scale. And the trade corridor made it possible. It brought the missionaries, the bishops, the relics, the architectural styles that made this transformation visible. A pilgrim traveling from Gaul to Italy would see the same pattern. A majestic church on a hill that had once held a pagan temple. That continuity of sacred geography made the new faith feel less foreign. More like the natural evolution of the land's own holiness. This filtering process had a deep effect on the stories that could travel. The loose, adaptable pagan myths that had flowed freely along the corridors now faced a gatekeeper. A story about a shape-shifting forest spirit might be called demonic and suppressed in a newly Christianized region. But if that spirit could be reinterpreted as a fallen angel or a test from God, it might survive in a new, cautionary form. The corridor became a battleground for narrative survival. The myths that made it through this doctrinal filter were often the ones that could serve a new purpose. A tale about a generous but anonymous stranger could easily become a story about a disguised saint performing a miracle. The core of unexpected kindness stayed, but the cosmic explanation shifted. That's why so much folklore in Christian and Islamic lands feels like a layer cake. On the surface, you have the sanctioned story of the saint or the prophet. But you dig a little, you listen to the old village tale told at the fireside, and you can hear the whisper of the older, wilder spirit underneath. The trade routes didn't just spread the new religions. They also spread the method of this ancient cultural negotiation. They showed how to conquer a landscape not by erasing its stories, but by writing your own chapter into them. The old myths didn't die, they went underground or they put on a new mask. They learned to speak the language of the New World Order, and that ensured their survival in a changed marketplace of belief. There was this king who never existed. A letter started moving through Europe in the 12th century. It was sent to the Byzantine emperor and the pope. The man writing it said he was Prester John, a priest king, immensely pious, unimaginably powerful. He said he ruled a huge kingdom far to the east, past Persia and Media. A paradise, no crime, no want. It had the fountain of youth, it had fantastical creatures, and he was marching west with his armies to help fellow Christians against their enemies. The letter was a forgery, but the hope it lit was very real. This wasn't a folktale that just grew over time. This was a strategic myth. It was assembled like a mosaic. From the scattered pieces of information that came down the Silk Road, Europe was locked in the Crusades then, the dream of a powerful Christian ally appearing from behind the Islamic world. That was a potent fantasy, and the trade routes gave just enough raw material to make it seem possible. First, there were the real reports, even if they were misunderstood. Nestorian Christians, their sect had spread east centuries before. They did have communities scattered along the Silk Road, from Persia all the way to China. Travelers' tales mentioned these Christians in the east. Then came the earth-shaking news, the Mongol conquests. As Genghis Khan's armies swept across Central Asia, they shattered the powerful Islamic states. The ones that had blocked European ambitions. To observers in Rome or Paris, this was incomprehensible. It had to be part of a divine plan. The Mongols must be the forces of Prester John, finally on the move. The fact that the Mongols weren't Christian, that they were a greater threat to everyone, that detail was lost in translation across 5,000 miles. Gossip from the caravanserais hardened. It became diplomatic certainty. The corridor took fragments, a real Christian community here, a massive military victory there. And it fused them into a single, glorious story of salvation. This myth immediately escaped the page. It started dictating real action. Kings and popes began sending envoys down those same trade routes. Not just to trade on a sacred quest, they carried letters for Prester John. They sought alliances with Mongol Khans, whom they truly believed were this lost king or his descendants. The myth became a driver of exploration, of diplomacy. It shaped how Europe engaged with Asia for centuries. it led directly to the journeys of men like Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, William of Rubruck, friars who traveled to the Mongol court hoping to find a Christian ally. They came back with the first accurate European accounts of the East. So the corridor here didn't just carry a story, it manufactured a geopolitical compass. The vague, second-hand reports from travelers, the lifeblood of trade gossip, were distilled. In the anxious minds of European rulers, they became a map for a desired future. The myth of Prester John was a fantasy born from the specific informational soup of the Silk Road. A narrative tool sharpened by hope and strategic need, and it shows that the stories moving on these routes could be more than explanations, more than warnings. They could be engines of history, compelling armies to march, ships to sail into the unknown, chasing a shadow cast by the whispering winds of commerce. The question of why myths resemble each other has often pointed to something deep in time, to a shared human consciousness, to archetypes buried in our collective mind. Those are profound ideas, but there's another explanation, a more recent one tied to geography. It's the map on the table, the trade route. This view doesn't replace the search for universal themes. It adds another layer, a historical transmission network. It asks a simpler question: could these similarities have spread not from a shared psyche, but from a shared caravan road? Take the flood story, found in dozens of cultures worldwide, from Greece to India. The traditional view might see this as a universal memory. A primal fear of drowning may be tied to the end of the last ice age. That's a powerful, deep time explanation. But then you look at the map of the ancient Near East, at the Bronze Age trade networks linking Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia. And you see a story with a very specific shape, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. In it, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a great boat to save his family and the seed of all living things from a flood. He sends out birds to find land. The parallels to the later biblical story of Noah are clear. This isn't a vague archetypal flood. This is a specific narrative package with a warning, a boat, animals, birds. Now, did this story spring up independently in Mesopotamia and later among Hebrew scribes? Or is it more likely the story traveled? The corridor model suggests the latter. For centuries before the Hebrew scriptures were compiled, the civilizations were in constant contact. Through trade, war, diplomacy, the cultural currents of Mesopotamia flowed into canon. The story of the Great Flood, a cornerstone of Mesopotamian literature, would have been part of that exchange. It was narrative software that could be adapted. The Hebrews didn't just copy it, they rebooted it. They placed it within their own monotheistic framework. The many capricious gods of Gilgamesh became the single, purposeful god of Genesis. The morals shifted, but the core plot, that specific sequence, remained. This isn't about diminishing originality. It's about tracing a tangible pathway. We can draw a line on a map through known historical contexts for how this story could have moved. From the clay tablets of Nineveh to the scrolls of Jerusalem, this changes how we see other parallels. The story of a hero descending into an underworld to bring back a loved one. You find it in Mesopotamia with Ishtar, in Greece with Orpheus. The corridor lens encourages us to look at the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as the ultimate trade route. A liquid highway connecting Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece for millennia. Phoenician traders, those master mariners, didn't just carry purple dye and glass. They carried stories, a motif from an Egyptian myth about the journey through the Juwat, the underworld, could have been a tale told on a Phoenician ship. By the time it was retold in a Greek port, reshaped by Greek poets, it became the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. The universal human experience is the grief of loss. The specific story of a musical journey to the land of the dead that could be a historical import. This approach doesn't erase the power of myth. it grounds it in human connection. It turns a mysterious, simultaneous global awakening into a documented conversation, a conversation that happened at the speed of a sailing ship, at the pace of a camel caravan. It allows us to connect dots through diplomacy, through marriage alliances between royal courts, through migrant craftsmen bringing their gods to a new city. The similarity between a Greek myth and an Indian one might not mean our ancestors all shared a single story 10,000 years ago. It might mean that by 2,500 years ago, the narrative networks between them were already robust. Stories had already made the long journey across the Iranian plateau. The corridor model gives us a historical mechanism, a way to understand the spread of imagination itself. And if stories could travel such distances in the ancient world, what happened when those worlds finally met face to face in the age of exploration, when the corridor became the entire globe? A story in motion is a living thing, it changes, but when the road goes quiet, when the caravans stop, the ports fall silent, the myth doesn't vanish, it freezes. It becomes a fossil, a perfect snapshot of the moment the conversation ended. The Great Silk Road is the clearest example. For centuries, it was a roaring river of ideas. Then, starting around the 15th century, a shift happened. European ships began sailing around Africa, straight to Asia. It was faster, cheaper, could carry more. Slowly, the overland arteries began to wither. The caravanserais emptied. Hubs like Samarkand, these multilingual places, they lost their central role. And the myths born there, in that constant churn of Sogdian merchant culture, they stopped evolving. They were caught mid-stride. There's a story about a dragon guarding a mountain pass in a Central Asian manuscript from the 14th century. That story represents a specific moment, a long dialogue between Persian and Chinese traditions. But after the corridor faded, that dragon's evolution largely stopped. It became fixed, preserved in that text like an insect in amber. It no longer had fresh travelers to retell it, to tweak it for a new audience in Baghdad or Zion. It became a historical artifact. Its development timeline gives us a date. The point where that story stopped picking up new traits tells us roughly when that stream of cultural traffic slowed to a trickle. We see this fossilization everywhere a corridor dies. The Amber Road, that northern network for thousands of years, it eventually became obsolete. The myths and protective symbols that traveled with the amber, they didn't keep spreading and transforming into the modern era. They are largely locked in the ground, in the burial sites, the hoards that archaeologists uncover. A solar wheel amulet found in a grave tells us about belief at the time it was buried. But its story lineage often ends there. It didn't keep evolving into a new symbol in later centuries. It's a closed loop, a finished sentence in a conversation that stopped. This is incredibly valuable for historians. It turns mythology into a kind of clock. If you find a version of a myth in two places and you can trace its journey, you can map the connection. But if you find that the myth in one place is a perfect, unchanged copy of a much older version from another, and it shows no signs of later local influence, that tells you something else. It suggests the connection was severed, the corridor that carried that story closed. The myth became a fossil at the point of import. It never got the chance to adapt to its new home, to hybridize. So by studying where a myth's development suddenly halts, we can often pinpoint when a trade route, a cultural exchange route, became less active. The stories become proxies. Narrative fingerprints for economic and political history. They show us the flow of human connection, and just as importantly, they show us when that flow was cut off. The fossilized myth is a monument to a lost road, but if old corridors can fade, new ones are always being born. And in our modern, connected world, the rules of this ancient game have changed. In ways the Sogdian merchants could never have dreamed. The old caravan roads went quiet, but the patterns they made, those never really left. We just rebuilt the corridors. In a new material, light and data, the internet is the ultimate trade network, a digital Silk Road that crosses the globe in milliseconds, and on it you see the same old principles of myth-making. Playing out in real time, social media platforms are the new caravanserais. They're these bustling way stations. People from countless subcultures gather there. They exchange their goods, which are now images, videos, text, and then they move on. The stories that thrive here are built for this kind of travel. They're lean, adaptable, designed for rapid remix. Take a modern legend like the Slender Man. It started over a decade ago on an online forum, a simple Photoshop contest to make paranormal images. Someone posted a tall, faceless figure in a suit. That was the original Kernel, the portable core, like a description of a dragon from a distant land. Then it hit the corridor. Other users took that kernel. They wrote stories, made fan art, produced elaborate video series. Each one was a retelling, an adaptation for a new audience inside this vast digital oasis. Some versions made Slender Man a forest spirit, others a cosmic entity. Some stories were terrifying, others almost tragic. Canonical and variant versions exploded all at once. Just like 100 different descriptions of a rock would circulate in the ports of the Indian Ocean, no single author controlled it. The myth was being cooked by the collective. In the pressure cooker of the network itself, its rapid evolution, its branching paths, that's a speed run of a process that once took centuries on the Amber Road. It proves the model. A story enters a sustained corridor of interaction, and it will hybridize, mutate, spread at the speed of that corridor's traffic. Memes are maybe the purest form of this ancient currency. A single image macro, a video clip, a phrase. These are the modern mythic motifs. They're the small, hard nuggets of narrative the digital sieve selects for. They detach from their original context with ease. A trader from the funny animal community takes the motif, overlays it with the concerns of the political community. And a new version is born. It crosses from Twitter to TikTok to a niche forum, changing subtly with each stop to fit the local culture. It's barter. You take the structure. You inject your own meaning. This isn't so different from a Buddhist Jataka tale, stripped to its moral core so a Sogdian merchant could understand it. Then reclothed as a Turkic epic, the human software is the same. Only the hardware has been upgraded. Understanding this old model gives us a lens for our own chaotic information age. The viral spread of a conspiracy theory, the explosive growth of a fan theory for a show, the life cycle of an online challenge, they all follow the topology of an old trade map. They need hubs for convergence, they need pathways for distribution, and they require stories simple enough to survive translation across wildly different cultural spaces inside the digital continent. The impulse hasn't changed. We're still the merchants around the fire, sharing wonders to build rapport, to explain our world, to warn each other of unseen dangers. We still crave that shared storybook. The caravan is now made of fiber optic cable, but the cargo it carries, our need to make meaning together, that's as old as the first footpath between two villages. A story was never just a story, it was an ambassador. In the ancient world, you didn't send an army down a trade route first. You sent a myth that was soft power long before the phrase existed. When a culture's stories traveled and were accepted, it meant something. It meant that culture had prestige. Its view of the world was compelling enough for others to take it in. This exchange of narratives became a kind of cultural diplomacy, and trade gave it the neutral ground to happen. Take the routes from India to Southeast Asia. For 1,000 years, ships carried pepper and cloth, but they also carried the Ramayana. They carried the Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's past lives. These weren't imposed by force, they arrived as cargo, as stories told in the ports. In Sumatra, Java, Cambodia, local rulers and merchants heard them. They saw a sophisticated cosmology there, a moral framework, a real artistic potential. Adopting these stories became a sign of connection, a sign you were part of a wider, advanced world. So a king in Cambodia might build a temple with scenes from the Ramayana, not because an Indian army forced him, but because aligning his kingdom with that story lifted its status. It created a shared language with trading partners all across the Bay of Bengal. The myth built the bridge, and then the trade walked across. This was often a quiet negotiation. To accept a foreign deity or hero into your local pantheon was a diplomatic gesture. It said, "We see value in your world." It built trust. A trade deal between a Greek colony and a Phoenician city might be easier if both sides recognized the same storm god, even with different names. The myth created a sliver of common ground, a point of recognition in a landscape of difference. That shared story became a social lubricant. It made the machinery of cross-cultural commerce turn more smoothly. But this power had another edge, a darker one. The same symbolic language that could build bridges could also define enemies. If our stories portrayed the people beyond the mountains as chaotic monsters or children of a lesser god, that narrative justified keeping them away. It could sanction conflict. A myth could be a weapon of otherness, drawing a firm line between us and them. The trade corridor, though, had a way of softening even that. Prolonged contact forced stories to interact. The demonized other in a tale might, over generations of shared caravanserais, gain a more nuanced character. Maybe become a tragic figure. The corridor compelled revision. It demanded stories that could facilitate interaction, not just conflict, because conflict was bad for business. And that's the vital point. The exchange of myths along these routes was a primary form of international relations. It was how civilizations sized each other up, how they found common values and negotiated their place in a wider world. The merchant was an unintentional diplomat. His pack held silks and spices, but his mind carried the foundational narratives. The stories that would determine whether two people saw each other as allies or aliens. This narrative layer operated beneath kings and armies. It shaped perceptions in the marketplace and the temple. It created the cultural conditions that made formal alliances possible, or bitter rivalries. The stories set the stage long before the ambassadors ever arrived. Ivory wasn't just a material, it was a question. You'd have this tusk arriving in a Roman market, curved, heavy, impossibly smooth. It spoke of a creature beyond any boar or bull the buyer knew. The merchant, maybe from a North African port, had no photograph, no guidebook, just his story, and the story grew to fit the evidence. The tusk demanded a beast of proportionate grandeur. A monstrous elephant, sure, but in the retelling across the sea, it could become something else, a unicorn, a beast with a single, spiraled horn of pure ivory with magical properties. The physical object was the seed. The myth was the tree that grew around it, giving the object a legendary origin that far surpassed its mundane reality. That was the marketplace alchemy. A trade good never arrived alone. It arrived wrapped in a narrative necessity. Silk performed a similar magic. For centuries, the process was a state secret guarded by China. To the Romans, it was a miracle. A fabric lighter than linen, stronger than wool, with a liquid sheen that caught the light like water. How could such a thing be made by human hands? The logical answer, without facts, was that it couldn't be, so the myth provided a divine workshop. Pliny the Elder reported silk came from a tree in a distant land. Others said it was combed from special leaves. The most persistent story was that it was woven by creatures of myth, giant spiders sometimes, or the delicate work of forest nymphs. The sensory experience of silk, its unearthly smoothness, its whisper, suggested a non-human origin. It felt like something from a dream. The myth confirmed that feeling. It elevated the cloth from a luxury to a relic, a piece of a fairy tale you could wear. Then there was scent, the most elusive sense tied directly to memory and spirit. Frankincense and myrrh, resins from southern Arabia, they filled temples with rich, sacred smoke. When burned, they seemed to dissolve the barrier between earth and heaven. Their aroma was so potent, so unlike any local pine, that its origin demanded an epic explanation. The trade routes had one. The resins weren't mere tree sap. They were the tears of gods, or they grew in guarded groves in a mythical paradise protected by winged serpents. The intoxicating scent was proof of this divine provenance. To breathe it in was to inhale the atmosphere of paradise. The myth didn't just explain the scent, it prescribed its use. Such a substance could only be fit for communicating with the divine, for honoring kings. The story dictated the ritual. The value wasn't in the chemistry, but in the celestial biography the traders attached to it. This created a loop. A merchant with cinnamon bark didn't just sell a spice. He sold a miniature epic. He told of the giant cinnamon bird, the Cinnamologus, that built its nests from the sticks on inaccessible cliffs. Harvesters, he'd say, used clever tricks or offered oxen as bait to lure the bird and collect the fallen cinnamon. It was a brilliant sales pitch. It explained the scarcity, justified the price. The danger of the harvest was woven into the tale, and the customer, holding the cinnamon, now held a piece of that adventure. The myth increased the commodity's perceived value, and the commodity in the buyer's hand served as proof that the myth must be at least partially true. Why else would such a strange bark exist? The object validated the story. The story sanctified the object. The marketplace became a theater of the imagination. Every stall with foreign wonders was a prompt. Amber, holding ancient insects, was proof of the tears of the sun. Pepper, so fiercely pungent, was said to grow in jungles guarded by poisonous snakes. Each strange fruit, each glittering gem carried a shadow story, a best guess from the limits of knowledge, inflated by the need for wonder and the merchant's need for a good tale. These myths were the original branding. They gave a commodity a soul, a story, a sense of place more compelling than a point on a map. They transformed items of trade into artifacts of belief. And so the routes of commerce were permanently lined with the statues of the imaginary creatures they had inspired. That Siberian dragon story isn't just one story. It's a stack of them, like layers of earth built up over centuries. To get the full story of a corridor, you have to read those layers. You have to brush away the dust of time. See what each era left behind. The top layer is usually the most recent. In that Siberian village, that's the medieval Turkic traders. They were the last big wave before modern times. They brought a specific dragon with them from the Islamic and Persian world, a guardian of treasure, a test for heroes. Its motifs are sharp. That layer sits on the surface. It colors the most recent tellings, but you dig a little deeper. Beneath that, there's an older stratum, from 1,000 years before the Turkic traders. When the Scythians roamed the steppes, those nomadic warriors had their own animal art and myth. Their dragon was probably a composite beast, griffin-like. Made of gold and power, a symbol of the fierce, open grasslands. That layer is fainter now. The details are blurred, but its shape is still there in the story's skeleton. It gives the dragon an older, wilder feel, a connection to the raw landscape itself, and then at the very bottom there might be a foundational layer. The deepest one, the most primal, that could be a simple, indigenous reverence for serpents, a belief in a great spirit of the river or the earth, taking the form of a snake. This isn't a dragon with wings or hordes. It's a powerful chthonic force, a being of the land itself. It's the seed everything else grew from. Disentangling this is delicate work. It means comparing dozens of variants of the same story, collected all along the suspected trade route. A scholar lines them up from the Siberian version back through Central Asia, into Persia, maybe even to a possible origin point in Mesopotamia or China. They look for patterns which motifs only appear in the Eastern versions. Which ones only show up after a certain date in the West? It's like tracking a genetic mutation through a population. The key is to cross-reference those narrative clues with hard history. Periods of intense trade leave a thick layer of new motifs in the stories. Like the height of the Silk Road under the Mongol peace, you might see a sudden infusion of Chinese dragon pearls, or Persian winged serpents in Central European folklore, right at that time. And when a corridor closes, when war or plague silences the roads, the story layers stop changing. The myth fossilizes, it captures that moment like a snapshot. This detective work shows the corridor's true biography. It wasn't a single event, not a one-time exchange. It was a series of narrative waves, a slow, persistent dripping of ideas over millennia. The first wave might have been a basic concept, a water serpent. Centuries later, a new wave from a different civilization adds treasure hoarding. Another wave, centuries after that, adds wings and the breath of fire. Each wave leaves its own sedimentary deposit in the local stories, until the final myth is a complex amalgam of epochs, so that Siberian dragon is more than a monster. It's a living timeline. Its scales are from one era, its wings from another, its fiery breath from a third. To hear the full story is to listen not to one voice but to a chorus of centuries. A chorus that only sang because a road was kept open, season after season, century after century, letting the world's imagination slowly blend into something new. And if we can hear the history in a single myth, what happens when we listen to the silence between them, to the stories that were lost along the way? A corridor is a threshold. You pass through it, you don't stay there, and the mind has always feared thresholds. The old trade routes were the ultimate in-between spaces. They weren't home, and they weren't the settled order of a foreign capital either. They were the gap in between, a desert that stretched for weeks, a mountain pass where the wind never stopped. The open ocean with no landmark but the stars. These were liminal zones, and human psychology across cultures fills zones like that with monsters. It's no coincidence that maps of old trade routes are also maps of concentrated folklore. The danger wasn't just physical, it was existential. To be on the road was to be betwixt and between. Unmoored from the social rules that told you who you were, vulnerable in a way that felt supernatural. So the mind, to cope, gave that anxiety a face, a shape it could understand. The desert produced the ghoul. In Arab folklore, it wasn't just an animal, it was a shape-shifting spirit of the empty places. It could appear as a lost traveler, luring the lonely off the path, or as a beautiful woman, only to reveal a monster. The ghoul personified the desert's two great terrors: isolation and illusion, the mirage that promised water but led to death, the fear that your own companion in that trackless waste might not be who he seemed. The story gave a rule: don't trust strangers in the wilderness, don't stray from the known path. It was a narrative survival guide born from the sand. The mountains gave us trolls. In Norse and Scandinavian tales, trolls live under bridges, in caves, on lonely peaks. They control the passes, they demand a toll. Sometimes in gold, sometimes something worse. This myth reflects the mountain corridor's reality. The physical toll of the climb was immense, but the human toll could be greater. Local chieftains often controlled key passes, demanding payment from caravans. The troll mythologized that extortion. It turned a political hardship into a natural law of the landscape. The mountain itself was hostile. Its guardian spirit was greedy and cruel. You couldn't reason with a rockfall. You couldn't argue with a blizzard, so you couldn't argue with a troll. You paid or you found another way. The story taught preparedness. It taught that certain landscapes have inherent rules, and to ignore them was to die. Then there's the sea, the most profound liminal space of all. Neither land nor sky, but a shifting plain between. Here, the greatest danger was often seduction. The siren's song, it promised everything the weary sailor craved: knowledge of the world, the memory of home, rest, but it led only to shipwreck. This myth is a masterclass in the psychology of the corridor. The siren represents the temptation of the liminal state itself, the desire to stop moving, to find an easy answer in a realm that offers none, to believe a beautiful lie when the truth is a relentless, punishing voyage. The siren was the embodiment of navigational despair, the hope for a shortcut that doesn't exist. Her story warned that in the between places, the most attractive promise is often the deadliest trap. These stories did more than scare, they managed anxiety. By giving the danger a name and a form, they made it something that could, in theory, be dealt with. A ghoul could be outwitted with sacred words. A troll might be tricked by a clever traveler until the sun turned it to stone. A siren's song could be resisted if you stuffed your ears with wax. The myths provided a protocol, a set of imagined actions for confronting unimaginable stress. They created a cognitive map. This wasn't a map of miles, but a map of fears. It charted the psychological terrain of the journey. Here you will feel isolated, beware the ghoul. Here you will be extorted, prepare for the troll. Here you will be tempted to give up, ignore the siren. This is why these tales cluster so thickly along the historic routes. They were a shared mental infrastructure. A merchant from Cairo and a pilgrim from Constantinople meeting in a caravanserai might not share a language, but if one drew a symbol in the sand for a desert spirit, the other would nod. They shared the map, they understood the psychological landmarks of the corridor. The stories were a way of saying, I have been in the between place too. I know its rules, and in that recognition, some of the terror lifted. The liminal space was still dangerous, but it was no longer unknowable. It had been storied. It had been given a mythology, and in doing that, the human mind had carved a slender path of meaning through the heart of the unknown. The corridor wasn't just about acceptance. It was also about refusal. For every myth that was welcomed, there were local tales that rose up, quiet defiance. These were resistance myths, narratives built not to help exchange, but to build a wall against it. They show the other side of the conversation, the pushback, a local voice saying, this is who we are. Your story doesn't define our home. You see this where a powerful cultural force arrived. Like Buddhism along the Silk Road into Central Asia, it brought a rich cosmology, new heroes, new ways of seeing, but in some regions, local traditions didn't just fade. They fought back with story. A pre-existing local deity, maybe a warrior spirit of the mountains, could be recast in a new legend. In this tale, the local hero confronts a monstrous demon from afar. A demon bringing chaos, and that demon, in its description, often looked like the new, foreign ideas. It might be a seductive preacher of false peace, or a shapeshifter stealing souls. By having the local hero win, the story reaffirmed the older ways. It was an act of cultural self-defense. The community was telling itself, we are not being conquered. Our guardians are still strong. Another form was the origin story, the story of how something came to be. When a foreign religion or empire arrived, it often tried to claim the landscape, to build its temples on the sacred hills, to rededicate the healing springs to its own saints. The local response was sometimes to double down, to tell, with more fervor, the tale of how that hill was created by the tears of a local ancestor, or how the spring burst forth when a beloved chieftain struck the ground. This story rooted the place in an unassailable local past, a past that predated any caravan, any missionary. It declared, this land was sacred to us before you knew it existed. Your new name is just paint on a stone we carved. This narrative anchoring was a tool. It let a community physically accept a new temple on their holy site, while mentally keeping the older meaning. The foreign structure became just a shell. The real spirit of the place, they knew, was from their own story. These resistance myths show cultural exchange wasn't a one-way street. It was a dialogue, sometimes a heated one. The local population weren't blank slates. They were active participants, editors of the narrative flowing in. They could take a foreign story and subvert it. There are tales in the Caucasus, for instance, where Prometheus was retold, the Greek titan who brought fire, but in the local version he wasn't chained by Zeus. He was a local champion punished by an arrogant foreign sky god for giving knowledge to his people. The bones of the Greek myth are there, but its moral allegiance is flipped. Captured and turned into a story of indigenous resilience against outside oppression. Understanding these counter-narratives is crucial. They correct the image of passive absorption. They reveal the corridors as spaces of tension. The flow of ideas created pressure, and that pressure generated narrative friction. The resistance myth was the spark. A community using the only weapon it had that could match the scale of the invasion, the power of a better story about itself, a way to maintain identity. To draw a line in the sand of the imagination and say, this far and no further. And in doing so, these communities didn't just preserve their past, they actively shaped the future of the mythic landscape. Ensuring their own voice remained in the chorus, echoing down the ages. The bones of a saint or a dragon's bones, they weren't just relics, they were places you went to. By the late medieval period, something had shifted. The stories that used to travel with the spices, they started generating their own traffic. Pilgrimage routes to sites made holy by legend, they became these new economic corridors. The myth itself was the main export now. If a town claimed to have the skull of a slain dragon, or the tomb of a heroic saint from an epic, its fortunes could change overnight. Travelers would arrive, they needed food, shelter, guides, souvenirs. You could build a whole local economy on a single, powerful story. This was spiritual tourism beginning. And it closed a cycle. First, the trade routes carried the myth. Then, the fully formed myth created a new kind of trade. Take the journey to Santiago de Compostela. For centuries, pilgrims walked the Camino. They were drawn by the belief that St. James's remains were there. That belief, that story, it turned footpaths across France and Spain into these bustling highways of faith and commerce. Inns, churches, markets, they sprang up to serve the constant flow. The local sale of scallop shells, the pilgrim's badge, that was a direct economic result of the myth. The physical journey was hard, but its purpose was narrative. People were walking a story, and their footsteps funded the towns along the way. This trade in the intangible, it needed tangible proof. So the relic market boomed. A feather said to be from the rock could fetch a fortune from a collector of marvels. A sliver of wood, authenticated as a piece of the true cross, held this incalculable spiritual and political value. These objects were the ultimate branded merchandise. Their worth wasn't material, it was narrative, the story attached to them, the certificate of authenticity from a compelling legend. That's what gave them power. Kings would pay vast sums for such relics to bolster their own divine legitimacy. A cathedral displaying a famous relic could draw pilgrims from across a continent, filling its coffers with donations. The relic was a spiritual investment with a very earthly return, and this system created a feedback loop. The more popular a pilgrimage site became, the more elaborate its myths grew. New miracles were reported. The saint's biography expanded with fresh, wondrous details. These enhanced stories would then attract even more pilgrims, generating more wealth, which funded grander cathedrals to house the relics, cathedrals that themselves became legends. The myth and the marketplace were in partnership now, each fueling the other's growth. A local legend could be amplified by clever clergy or town elders, marketing their community to the devout traveler. The story was the engine of local development, so the corridor, once a path for moving goods, had evolved into a path for moving believers. The cargo was now faith, wonder, the desire for connection to a story larger than oneself. It shows this deep entanglement of narrative and commerce. Belief, when channeled by a powerful story, has always had a tangible market value. It can build roads, fund cities, shape the geography of human movement as surely as any river or mountain pass. The ancient trade routes taught people how to share stories. Now, those stories were teaching people how to build a new world with the map of legend as their guide. Tracking a story's journey, it's not just about having a map. You need evidence. You pull it from the dust of old cities, from the faded ink in manuscripts. So the question becomes, how do you tell a shared human dream from a story that actually traveled? Scholars have built a kind of toolkit for this. They treat the spread of a myth like a detective case. The first place they often look is the words themselves. Philologists, these experts in ancient languages, they compare different versions of a story across cultures. They look for signs, a name that sounds similar in two distant languages that suggests it was borrowed, or a specific, unusual plot detail. It shows up in a text from India, and then centuries later, in a manuscript from Armenia. The key is finding these narrative fingerprints along a known historical route. If the story grows simpler as you move away from a suspected origin, or if it picks up local details, that's a strong clue. The text becomes a trail of breadcrumbs left by scribes and storytellers across the miles, but words can fade, objects last. That's where archaeology comes in. Researchers aren't just digging for treasure, they're digging for symbols. They trace the spread of a specific icon. Take the image of a winged horse. Does it appear first on Greek coins, then on Sogdian wall paintings, and later on Chinese metalwork? Mapping the chronology and geography of that image's appearance, it can chart a visual journey. One that mirrors the story's path. A figurine of a foreign god found in the ruins of a port city, that's physical proof. The idea of that god arrived there. Probably carried by the sailors who traded in that harbor. Folklorists add another layer. They collect thousands of local variants of a tale. They build these massive databases of motifs. And then they map the distribution. Imagine plotting every known version of a lost city legend. If the most complex, detailed versions cluster in one region, and simpler, more fragmented versions radiate out along trade routes, that strongly suggests a point of origin. A path of dissemination. It's like watching a stone drop in a pond and tracing the ripples. Then there are the latest tools from genetics and historical linguistics. Studies of ancient human DNA can reveal periods of major migration, contact between populations. Did two groups mix genetically around the same time? A myth appears to have jumped between them. That correlation supports the possibility of cultural exchange, and linguists studying how language families branched apart, they can provide a timeline. If the words for a certain mythical creature are loanwords in one language, borrowed from another, it tells us the concept arrived after the languages had diverged. It gives us a rough date for the story's import. The real power is in triangulation. One piece of evidence might be suggestive, but when the philologist's textual clue, the archaeologist's artifact, the folklorist's motif map, and the geneticist's evidence of population contact all point in the same direction, the case becomes compelling. You move from saying these stories are similar to proposing a probable historical pathway. You can begin to reconstruct that invisible journey, not just of a spice or a silk, but of an idea. One that captured the human imagination, changing subtly with every retelling from one fireside to the next, until it became part of the world's shared storybook. The long history of shared stories makes you ask a modern question. Where does respectful blending end and just taking something begin? We call that cultural appropriation now. The ancient world didn't have that term, but you can see the patterns. There's beautiful synthesis, and then there's clumsy borrowing. Sometimes it's exploitative. The difference is often in the speed and the intent. Look at positive syncretism. That's a slow process, a thoughtful adaptation. A myth arrives, but it isn't just swallowed. It's tasted, discussed, its meaning gets negotiated with the local stories that are already there. The result isn't a copy, it's a new creation. It honors the source and the new home. Think of Buddhism moving from India into Tibet. It didn't erase the local Bon tradition, that deep reverence for mountain spirits, for nature deities. Instead, a fusion happened. Those ancient Bon spirits were re-envisioned. They became protective deities within the Buddhist framework, guardians of the Dharma. Their fierce power was channeled to defend the new faith. The local worldview wasn't discarded, it was integrated, given a new role in a larger story. This was a dialogue. It took centuries. It required mutual respect, even with profound change. The myth adapted to the people, and the people adapted the myth. Until it became authentically theirs. Then there's the other kind, exploitative borrowing. That's when a story is taken swiftly without understanding. Stripped of its context, imagine a colonial power arriving somewhere new. Officials hear a local legend, a powerful ancestral spirit. They find the imagery striking. Exotic, so they extract that image, put it on a coin, use the name for a ship. They turn a sacred narrative into a decorative motif. The original community's relationship to the story, its rituals, its warnings, its place in their identity, all of that is ignored. The story becomes a trophy, cultural loot, displayed for its novelty, not its wisdom. This is extraction, not exchange. It's one-sided. It takes without giving back understanding or respect. The myth gets hollowed out, an empty shell. Studying these ancient examples gives you a long-term perspective. It shows that ethical cultural exchange has a rhythm. It's rarely fast. It thrives on sustained contact, on prolonged negotiation, like in those Silk Road caravanserais where people lived alongside each other. It involves a two-way street, a willingness to be changed by the story you're receiving, not just to use it. The ethical process looks less like extracting a resource. It looks more like slow, patient translation, finding the human core in a foreign tale and carefully reclothing it in local meaning so it can truly live in a new land. This ancient mirror doesn't give easy answers for today, but it offers a warning and a model. The warning is that when stories are taken too quickly, without context or reciprocity, they become lifeless curiosities. The model is that when stories travel slowly, when they're remade through genuine dialogue, they can build bridges of understanding that last for millennia. The difference is in the journey, not just the destination. The world is different now. Our corridors are made of light, not dirt. So you have to ask, where does that leave the old map of myth? In a connected age, are these historic routes for stories just obsolete? It's complicated. In one sense, the digital world makes them seem irrelevant. A story can go around the planet in seconds. There's no dusty journey anymore, no slow movement through trading posts. It's instantaneous. A myth can start in a forum and become a global thing before the day is over. That speed suggests geography doesn't matter, that the corridor as a physical limit is finished, but speed isn't depth. A viral meme flashes and then it's gone. The myths that traveled the old roads had to prove they could last centuries. They were tested by translation, by adaptation. The digital fire hose can spread a story, but it doesn't always make it lasting. It often just amplifies noise. There's another, quieter threat from all this connection: homogenization. As global pop culture takes over, local myths can get pushed to the side. A superhero movie reaches a remote village faster than an elder can tell the old tale of the mountain spirit. Those powerful, standard narratives from global entertainment can drown out the delicate, local stories. It risks creating one single, flat storybook for the whole world, erasing the unique mythic voice of every valley and coast. In that way, the new global corridor doesn't carry stories for exchange. It broadcasts one story for consumption, and yet the corridor model is stubborn. It just puts on new clothes. Look at diaspora communities. A family moves from West Africa to London, or from Vietnam to Houston. They bring their stories. In their new homes, they form communities, both physical and digital. Those communities become modern cultural corridors. Through them, the myths of the homeland are kept alive, but they are also adapted. The tale of the river spirit might be told now to explain navigating a new, concrete city. The stories get translated not just into a new language, but into a new reality. They become tools for making sense of displacement, for holding onto identity across distance. This is a corridor of memory kept by people, not by trade goods. But it works the same way. It lets a narrative travel and adapt to a new place so it survives. The physical world might even bring back ancient pathways in surprising forms. Climate change is opening new Arctic shipping lanes. As the ice retreats, sea routes that were impossible for centuries are becoming real. This isn't just an economic shift. It's the creation of a new geographic corridor, and corridors, as we know, generate stories. What new myths will come from the Arctic? Tales of spirits of the melting ice. Stories of hidden things revealed by the retreating frost, or old Inuit stories carried on new ships to distant ports where they'll blend with other seafaring traditions. A changing climate could literally redraw the map of how myths move. Maybe the biggest shift is from geography to ideology. The future might have fewer myths tied to a specific mountain or river, and more myths tied to a system of belief, a digital tribe. Online echo chambers work as powerful new corridors. They have their own way stations, certain websites, influencers. They have their own common language, shared jargon, and memes. And they carry myths, not about dragons, but about hidden conspiracies, about fallen golden ages, about heroes and enemies. These narratives spread at internet speed, but they follow the old, familiar shape. They need hubs. They demand simplification to travel. They adapt to the local fears and hopes of the people listening. An ideological myth born on one continent can be tailored and used on another, all inside the closed loop of a digital world. This is the dark potential of the ancient model, but supercharged, so the corridors aren't obsolete. They've multiplied, they've changed form. The core mechanism is still there. Humans, when faced with connection, with change, with the anxiety of not knowing, will still reach for stories. We use them to map new realities, to build community across distance. To warn of new dangers, to sanctify new hopes. The pathways have evolved from camel tracks to fiber optic cables, from spice ships to social media algorithms. But the cargo is the same, the need is the same. We are still the merchants around the digital fire, sharing wonders, trying to make sense of a world that is, once again, being remade right in front of us. The geography of the imagination is being redrawn, but the compass we use to navigate it is as old as the first story ever told. The map of myth is really a map of us. It shows the oldest roads we ever made, not for conquest but for talking. Those trade routes, they were more than just economic channels. They were like the nervous system of the ancient world. And every story that moved along them was a spark, a thought jumping from one mind to another across whole continents. The dragon, the siren, the lost city of gold, these aren't random. They're the intellectual spillage, the leftover data from 1,000 chance meetings in a desert oasis or a crowded port. They record our deepest transactions. Not silver for silk, but wonder for wisdom, fear for a warning, a strange tale traded for a moment of shared understanding around a fire. It shows something true about the stories we've told for thousands of years. They're not just about gods and monsters, they're living archives of human connection. They map our ancient wants for wealth, for safety. They trace our deepest fears. Of the unknown, of the treacherous mountain pass, of the seductive stranger, and most of all, they document our encounters, our sustained, messy, creative encounters with the other. The reason a specific myth only shows up along a certain trade route is simple. That route was the only place where the ingredients to make it could ever come together. The Chinese dragon needed the Persian serpent, the Arabian rock needed the Indian Garuda, the corridor was the kitchen, and the story was the meal that could only be cooked there. So when we piece these narrative journeys together, we're doing more than studying folklore. We're reverse engineering the synapses of a global brain that's been thinking together for millennia. Every shared motif, every hybrid creature is a fossilized handshake, proof that long before satellites, we were weaving a single tapestry of imagination. Thread by thread, tale by tale, along the slow roads of camel and sail, it reframes our modern idea of globalization. We talk about it like it's new. An overwhelming force, but the myths tell a different story. They show it might be our oldest, most persistent project. We have always been connecting. Trading goods, yes, but more importantly, trading the stories that explain why those goods and the journeys to get them matter. Our ancestors were globalists. Globalists of the imagination, they just moved at the speed of a walking camel. Next time you hear an old story, a fairy tale, a local legend, even a family anecdote, ask a different question. Don't just ask what it means, ask where it's been, whose hands carried it, what forgotten roads did it walk, what other stories did it meet and merge with along the way. In its twists and turns, you might hear an echo, a caravan bell, or the distant creak of a ship's timber carrying the most precious cargo away to see the world. Meant to be shared.